There you are. Hello.
Hey, good to see you.
Good to see you too. How you doing?
I'm doing really well. I just got back from foraging in the hills above Berkeley.
Awesome. What were you finding?
Oh, lots of stuff. One thing is our West Coast version of ramps, Allium triquetrum.
Oh,
Um, Whole bunch of those. Those have started to come up. And then I got a bunch of mushrooms too.
fantastic. Oh, wow. So, of
Maybe I'll
what you
turn on the
collected,
light
how
so
many
you
of
can
those are
see them.
edible?
So we got a bunch of
Wow.
candy caps in here. This one is candy caps,
Mm-hmm.
and more candy caps, and more candy caps. So those we're going to use to make a cream caramel. And then Sapphirella piluliformis, also edible. And here we have Zoecomis subtomentosus. That's an edible bolete. And then here is Hygrophorus eburneus. So that's the cowboy's handkerchief. And that is super slimy, but also edible. And a new species of Bulbidius. This one is Bulbidius reticulatus, and that is edible. And then we have a couple along this side that are less edible. This one is Nolania, so it's an Entoloma family. And then we have some sulfur tufts, Hyphiloma fasciculare, so those are poisonous. And way down in here, they're really tiny, is Rhymbacia bryophylla, those grow on moss. And then I also got a bunch of Yerba Buena. So that is Clinopodium douglasii, and that is really good for making tea. It kind of has a taste that's like a cross between mint and basil.
That is so cool. That's quite the haul you got there.
Yeah,
Wow. Okay. Well, the chat is filling up here. Let's see here. We've got people from all over popping in. A lot of hello, hi, and yeah. So if you're not familiar with Alan Rockefeller, I posted a video earlier today, but in case you missed it, Alan is probably the world's leading fungal taxonomist. The man has identified and cataloged so many species at this point. It is insane. So we're very lucky to have him here. So you were just showing us some stuff that you found on a forage that you went on today. I went out today and I did not find much, but it is winter in Michigan, so you're lucky if you find a little enoki and maybe some like Betulina fomitopsis.
yeah, it's like the middle of the mushroom season here. And it's been raining like crazy. You probably see on the news all the flooding from California. And so today is our first day without rain in a while. So just a beautiful day today. And then it's going to start raining like crazy tomorrow. And so there's going to be a lot of mushrooms around.
Awesome. Yeah, I was in Mendo end of November, like the weekend after Thanksgiving, and went around with Gordon Walker, and I was just amazed at how many mushrooms there were. And he was acting like it wasn't a great mushroom day, and I was like, "Oh my god, no, this is fantastic! I haven't seen anything like this in so long." So we
Yeah,
haven't.
they get a lot.
Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say they get a lot of fog in the Fort Bragg area in Mendocino County. So there's just about always mushrooms there, even when it's not rainy season.
So cool. So we have a question here from somebody. Well, somebody here who says that as a former Californian, you've ID'd so many mushrooms that this person has posted in Facebook groups. I think that for many of us who've been in Facebook groups and been looking for identifications over the years, most of us have run into you at some point or another, and especially on like iNaturalist because you are all over iNat.
Yeah, I try to identify some stuff every day on iNaturalist. It's way too much during rainy season for me to do all of California. But generally, like this morning, I went and just did everything that's been found within a couple miles of my house. And so, at least I can help out the people in my immediate area.
Yeah. Did you say that there's a number that you shoot for every day?
Not really, but they kind of give them to you in blocks of 30 on the identify interface. So often I'll do like 30, 60, or 90. Like 30, usually takes me like 4 or 5 minutes. So I try to spend like 15 minutes and maybe do 90 of them and try not to get sucked in and just do it for hours.
Hmm.
Get out. But I like identifying mushrooms on there. It kind of helps out a lot of people and gives people like the extra push to go out and see what they can find and put it up on our naturalist.
Yeah. We've got a couple of people asking what your username on iNat is,
It's Alan_Rockefeller.
just like your TikTok handle. Yep.
Yep, same as TikTok and Facebook and everything else.
Always useful. We've got a few people who saw your haul there and are wondering what made you want to start foraging. I guess we can both answer this question.
Yeah, for sure. Um, just really quick, so I'll let you answer as well. But I started about 20 years ago when I was hiking on Christmas Day in Redwood City, and I had just moved to California, and there was just mushrooms everywhere, and I decided that there must be people that knew if they were edible or poisonous, or what the deal with all that was. And so I started taking pictures of them, and I think I ate my first chanterelle around 2004. And the more I did it, the more fun it became, and that's just decided about 12 years ago to quit my job and do mushroom hunting full time.
Awesome. Yeah, for me, I've been foraging as long as I've had memories, I think, but I started foraging for berries as a really little kid. I grew up in the Pocono Mountains, so blueberries everywhere. And I lived right in front of a bog, which is one of the best places to find high bush blueberries. And got interested in mushrooms probably when I was about 25. And for me, it was a honey mushroom. It was then called Armillaria tabescens, now Desarmillaria caspitosa, if I'm not mistaken. But I just saw this giant clump of mushrooms, and I was just like, this is weird, and took some pictures and put them up in the Indiana Facebook page for mushrooms, and some people were super nice and helped me identify them. And I think when you start noticing mushrooms, you just can't stop noticing them. They're everywhere, but a lot of people just don't see them at all.
Yeah, it seems like the more you learn, the more interesting they get. When you see a mushroom that you recognize, it's like seeing an old friend, and then when you see one you don't recognize, it just makes me really want to figure out what it is.
Definitely. Yeah, I resonate with that. Mushrooms do at this point feel like friends, especially especially ones that you recognize. And when you go back to the same spot year after year, and you see mushrooms coming up in the same place that you saw them last year, there's a certain character.
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot of favorite places that I go to in Mexico, and I just go to the same places every year. And then this spot I went today, it's right by my house, like a mile away. So I get to see how it changes, like as time passes, quite a bit.
Yeah, definitely. You've done quite a bit in Mexico over the years. When did you start going?
I started going in 2007, and in 2007 I went for a week, and a week in 2008, and a week in 2009, and then in 2010 I decided to quit my job and hunt mushrooms all the time. So I went for 3 months in 2010, and I've been going for kind of the whole Mexican mushroom season ever since. So that's about 5 months.
It's amazing. I've talked to a lot of people from that general area who have no idea that mushrooms even grow in Mexico.
Yeah, most people don't in the United States because the border is very dry. But if you look on like the satellite map, the uh, the southern part of Mexico is all very green. And so there's lots of beautiful pine oak forests, and then at the top of the mountains, it's all firs. And so there's a lot of very good mushroom habitat there.
I've seen some of the photos that you've posted, especially your bioluminescent fungi that you've found in Mexico. Some of them are just amazing.
Yeah, those are really cool. I've done a lot of walking around the woods at night with no light at all. And you just walk around and see everything that glows. And I've found more than 20 species in Mexico that glow.
So cool. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that in the Midwest we have a couple of bioluminescent fungi as well. Um, Especially, I think Pinellus stypticus is the first one that comes to mind, and you have a type of Pinellus stypticus out in California as well, correct?
Yeah, I think it's the same thing. And the last time I was in Michigan, I took some beautiful photos of Pinellus stypticus glowing. And the whole log was covered in them. They were glowing this eerie green color. So you just turn off all the lights, and there was this green spots all over the log, and those were the mushrooms.
I remember I was there for that walk. It was amazing.
Oh, cool.
Yeah, that was mushroom camp, right?
Yeah, exactly. With
Mm-hmm.
with Matt Schenk and all those people, that was fun.
Yeah, yeah. Matt took some amazing photos.
Yeah, he really did.
Yeah, you do a lot of mushroom photography. I'm a terrible photographer. I've never been able to quite figure out how to take a good photo of a mushroom, but you take a lot of mushroom photos and you use a technique that I had not until recently become aware of. It's like a stacking type of technique, like a focus stack.
Yeah, I started doing that about 3 years ago. And if you look at my photos from before 3 years ago and after 3 years ago, the difference is just, huge. And so what I do is I take a whole lot of photos and I combine them all into one picture where everything is in focus. And so it's basically bending the laws of physics because I can shoot with the aperture wide open. And normally that would give me a very, very narrow depth of field. But by combining a whole lot of frames, I can get as much depth of field as I want. And that means that the background is super blurry, but then the mushroom itself is razor sharp. So it is, it's a really good technique, and I use it just about for every picture. And if I'm not going to focus stack something now, I will just use my cell phone and take a quick cell phone photo.
Yeah. Are there any photographers in the chat? Might be. Yeah, a couple people saying I've begun to notice mushrooms a lot more. This is an interesting one. What's your favorite mushroom to find, edible or inedible?
I'm sorry, what did you say?
I there was a question over here. Somebody was asking, "What's your favorite mushroom to find, edible or inedible?"
Oh man, I mean, people ask me that all the time, and the honest answer is that my favorite mushroom is whatever mushroom is in front of me. So I like, edible mushrooms, poisonous mushrooms, just all sorts of weird polypores. Like, I kind of like them all.
Yeah, I kind of feel that way too. I know people ask me all the time what my favorite mushroom is, and usually I tell them it's probably something that I haven't found yet because the mushroom I'm most excited about is the one that's new to me.
Yeah, and there's so many new species that haven't been discovered yet. I'm sure you see new species all the time.
I'm sure. And a lot of what you're finding and classifying as these new species are things that people probably see more often than they realize. But you've been doing a lot
Yeah,
of
absolutely.
sequencing and stuff.
Yeah, some here in California, some of our most common mushrooms are new species. And so like at least two things in my box there are new species and like on a good day I'll go out and see 50 new species in a day.
Yeah, that's incredible. And I think what a lot of people don't realize is that mycology is a fairly young, it's a fairly young discipline, at least as far as we know it today. And a lot of the names that we have for things are just borrowed from things that look similar in Europe or in other places, but mostly Europe.
Yeah, exactly. So when I see somebody using a European name, or when I see myself using a European name, I will sequence the DNA and look where the DNA matches are. And so if I get 100% matches in Europe, I'll say, okay, cool, this European name is probably the right name. And when I see only matches from North America and nothing in Europe, but we only have a European name, then that's probably a new species.
Hmm. Yeah. We've got, okay, Mind Over Mycology is a great mushroom photographer. Big agree. Um, Somebody asking, how do we figure out that a common mushroom is a new species? I think that's a really good question because there is sort of a process to it. And this is where
Yeah,
citizen community science comes in.
yeah, exactly. So there's been a lot published over the years in the literature. So to really figure out if it's a new species, you kind of have to go through the literature. Um, Sometimes there'll be names that were published 100 years ago and just forgotten about. For example, my friend thought he discovered a new species of Lacaria in Florida. And generally, the first thing that I do if I suspect it's a new species is I'll sequence the DNA, the IPS gene, and that's something I can do just in my lab at home. Cost about $5 to sequence one. And so my friend sequenced a Lacaria he found in Florida, and everyone was calling it Lacaria amethystina, but Lacaria amethystina was described from Europe, and all of his sequence matches were from Eastern North America. And so we thought maybe it was a new Lacaria. So I kind of dug into the literature. And I found a paper from 1990 where somebody said that Lacaria calolepis, no, calospora, Lacaria calospora was the same as Lacaria amethystina. But then I looked up Lacaria calospora, and that was described from Massachusetts. And there was DNA matches for his Lacaria from New York, so it certainly occurs in Massachusetts too. So I think what I found is that Lacaria calospora is a forgotten name for what we call Lacaria amethystina in North America, or at least Eastern North America. So that's probably one that you see all the time in Michigan.
Yeah, probably. That's really cool. Yeah, so if you want to sequence a mushroom and you're just a regular person, what do you need to do?
Well, the easiest thing to do is just mail it to somebody that already has a lab set up. So there's one lab in Spain called Alvalab, and the website is alvalab.es. And if you send them a mushroom, they charge, I think it's like 17 euros, and they will send you the DNA sequence back. And so that's the easiest thing to do. Just pay them to sequence it. Also, if you can get an academic person that's to become interested in it, they'll usually sequence it that way. Just run it as in one of their runs. What I did is I asked my friend who was a biohacker if it's possible for me to do this DNA sequencing stuff at home, and he said, "Yeah, absolutely. In fact, it's super easy." So I started gathering the equipment, and now I have like a little laboratory, and it's really small. I can just put it in my car. In fact, last weekend I went down to Los Angeles and brought the DNA lab and set it up, and we did a DNA barcoding workshop, and that was really cool. But a whole bunch of people came. They all brought mushrooms. We sequenced all of them, and we found a few of them were new species, and then a few of them they had names, but they were very obscure. So we were able to be like, "Wow, I didn't know that thing occurs here in the Los Angeles area." Um, so it costs only about $1,000 to set up a DNA sequencing lab in your house, and then about $5 for each one you sequence.
Yeah, I know that the Indiana Mycological Society has one. They have a lab, but it takes like a few years. They have such a big backlog. Um, I'm part of the Michigan Mycological Society, and we've been talking about getting a lab to take some of the pressure off here in the Midwest, and also just because it would be really freaking cool. But
It
yeah, I
really
didn't
would.
realize how easy it actually is. Not to do it,
Yeah.
but to like get this stuff looked at.
Yeah, and it's not really that hard. it's the sort of thing I could teach someone how to do it in an afternoon.
Yeah, it's
And I
awesome.
see there's more questions coming through than I can answer. But one person asked, is he related to the famous Rockefeller family? And the answer is no, I have no relation to the famous Rockefeller family.
um, I think we're seeing the same questions. At least I got that question as well. Got
Yeah,
some
I think
questions.
so.
Okay, cool. Cool, cool.
And someone
Um,
else also asked if I ever work with mycorrhizal fungi. And some of the mushrooms that I found today were mycorrhizal. And so I certainly do DNA sequencing and microscopy on those things. And last year, I took some Amanita muscaria and put it on agar, and I got Amanita muscaria to grow on agar. And most people think you cannot cultivate Amanita muscaria because it's ectomycorrhizal, so you can't fruit it. But it actually grows just fine on agar. And if you clone it, you'll know you have the right fungus because it grows really slowly, about 1 centimeter per month. So I just broke open an Amanita muscaria, threw a little bit of flesh from the inside onto agar. And after a couple months, it had grown a couple centimeters. And so I scraped up a little bit of the mycelium that was growing and DNA sequenced that. And it turns out that it actually was the Amanita muscaria mycelium that was growing on the agar.
that is so cool. I think that when we learn things, we're inclined to put things in boxes, and two of those boxes in mycology are mycorrhizal and saprobic. But so many fungi display characteristics of both.
Yeah, I think so. I think all of the mycorrhizal fungi must have a saprobic phase because, they have to be in association with the tree roots, but the spore isn't going to land right on a tree root. The spore has to germinate and be able to make its own food and be able to grow down and into the tree roots so that it would be saprobic for the first part of its life cycle.
We've got a question about, are there truffles in the US? Yes, there are. There are some very cool ones here in the US. And some of them
And
are
there's
edible.
a lot more. Sorry, go ahead.
Oh, and some of them are edible.
Yeah, there's a lot more than people recognize. Sometimes they'll have underground mushroom forays where everyone brings a little rake, and you'll kind of go like under a tree and rake just a little bit and look for truffles, and then carefully replace the soil. And there are so many different truffles. There are hundreds of species of truffles. Now, most of them taste terrible and some of them are poisonous. But those culinary truffles are in the genus Tuber, and there's quite a few species in the genus Tuber in North America. Out here, we have Tuber gibosa and Tuber oregonense. So people call that the Oregon white truffle. And those you find under Douglas fir, and they are really good culinary truffles, on par with the European culinary truffles. And I think you have some in Michigan as well. And people just they're not uncommon. People just don't see them very often because they're a couple inches under the ground.
Yeah, generally the best place to look for edible truffles here is going to be near limestone. If you find like limestone gravel, that's going to be a good place to start raking. Right around there, white pine too.
And so they grow with white pines.
Mm-hmm. A lot of them do, but the edible ones, I can't remember the binomial off the top of my head, but it's like some. I think it's colloquially called the Appalachian truffle. Although it may have been initially found somewhere on the Appalachian Trail or in the Appalachians, but it also occurs here in Michigan.
Oh yeah, I just looked that one up. It says Tuber canaliculatum is the
Yes.
Appalachian truffle,
Yep.
and could be the next culinary star. It says.
We'll see. Let's see. There's a question about mycoremediation. This is such an interesting topic, and it feels like so much of the mycoremediation conversation is speculative right now, but there's some really interesting things happening in that conversation.
Yeah, I agree with you there. It's super speculative. And I think, it's such a wide topic. There's a million ways you can try to remediate stuff with mushrooms. Um, I've tried things like, oyster mushrooms eat oil. So I took just a drop of motor oil and put it on a colonized petri dish of oyster mushroom mycelium, and it just kills the mycelium. So if you're eating oil with oyster mushrooms, you kind of have to mix the oil in a real small amount, like maybe 10% or something like that.
Yeah, yeah. And I guess we could argue that mushrooms naturally occurring in the wild um, are already doing a really good job of mycoremediation on their own in many cases. You know, when you look, especially out in like the West Coast, after these massive fires come through, one of the first things that comes up are the Ascomycetes, and they do a lot of really important work bringing that diversity back to the soil.
Yeah, definitely. I think all the mycelium ties together and stabilizes the soil. And yeah, they're super vital part of the ecosystem. And so they're definitely saving the world every day, and they have been for a lot longer than humans have been around. But if humans want to use mushrooms to fix environmental problems, I think one of the best ways to do that is to get some used spawn from a mushroom farm, and then you can use that in your microremediation projects. Because if you just make new spawn for microremediation, you're burning a lot of oil, um, and using a lot of energy. But a lot of mushroom farms just throw away the used spawn blocks, and so you can use those to like prevent runoff or as water filtration or do all sorts of microremediation projects with that used spawn, and then you're using something that would have already been produced.
Definitely. Ooh, there's some really cool stuff in. Yeah, go for it.
I see Missing Meadows asked, does Alan have a mycology hero? And there are a lot of people that do a lot of really good work. I think the one person that comes to mind whenever people ask me that is Elsa Valinga, and she's a Swedish-born mycologist who works in Berkeley now, and she's one of the best mushroom taxonomists. She's discovered and described tons of new species. I saw her at the Fungus Foray in Nevada City a couple months ago, and that lady is really sharp. She can identify so many tiny little mushrooms, especially like Lepiotas is her specialty. And she published papers on chlorophyllum, and she discovered that the cat's tongue that we have in North America is a new species, and she's going to publish that soon. So she does really cool stuff. Also, like another local guy, Brian Perry, is a super nice guy, and he works on mycena. So he gives a lot of talks on the glowing mycenas, and he does really amazing microscope work. And he's going to teach a microscope class at Soma Camp this weekend. That's up in Sonoma County. Um, so there's really a whole lot of people that do really good work.
Yeah. I'm really glad that you brought up a female mycologist because a lot of the press around mycology is men. It looks like a very male dominated field, but it's really pretty 50-50 when you get down to brass tacks.
Yeah, I think that's about right. There's certainly a lot of men, identifying a lot of stuff, but there's also some really good women identifying a lot of stuff. One person I see on iNaturalist a lot who does a lot of identification all over the United States is Ariel Bonkowski.
Yeah,
Hopefully, I'm not
too. Love
I'm
her.
pronouncing her name right, but she's really cool. You see her on Facebook sometimes, but I see her turning up on iNaturalist, yeah, pretty often,
I,
and her identifications are really good. Like if she gives you a name, it's just about always going to be the right name.
yeah, I think she said that this past year she was like seventh in the U.S. for fungal identifications on INAT, which is pretty amazing because that is thousands and thousands of IDs.
Oh, that's amazing. Yeah, I haven't looked at that. I'm not sure how to get that thing to come up where it says who's which rank everybody is, but I bet there's a lot of cool people in the top 10.
Oh yeah, definitely. We've got a question about mushroom book recommendations, which is always such an interesting question to answer because it really depends so much on where you live. The recommendations that I'd be making for the West Coast are so different than the recommendations I'd be making for the East Coast. And you never know where people are from on TikTok.
Yeah, I mean, there's no book that is like a field guide to all the mushrooms in the world. And if there was such a book, it wouldn't be very good because there's just so many different mushrooms and all the different regions. And, a lot of mushrooms don't cross the Rocky Mountains. So a West Coast book is not going to be very good in Michigan. But on the West Coast, I think the favorite book, the best book by far is Mushrooms of the Redwood Coast. And that was written by Christian Schwarz and Noah Siegel. And it
Looks
was
like
just came out about 7 years ago. It has really good pictures. And one thing I like about that book is that the authors intentionally did not read the other books when they were writing it. So it's all like original research. And, so many mushroom books, it seems like they just kind of copy every other mushroom book. And that one's really different. So for the West Coast, I definitely recommend that one. What do you use in Michigan?
in Michigan, so I think that if you're just starting out, Mushrooms of the Upper Midwest by Teresa Marone is a really good beginner thing. I also really like Michael Kuo's books. He has a great guide to 100 edible mushrooms that he came out with a few years ago. Kuo is also, for those of you who don't know, he is the person who runs mushroomexpert.com, which is generally a pretty good resource. Some of the entries are pretty out of date, but there's a lot to keep up on. And if you're one person, it can be tricky. So those are a couple. Um, and then we're lucky in that we have quite a number of like more specific regional guides. So there's like a mushroom guide to Chicago. There's a mushroom guide to Michigan. There are some more like narrow mushroom books, and some of them are pretty good. Some of them are not. The thing with books and mushrooms, which I'm sure you've run into, is that information goes out of date very quickly because we're discovering so much every day. Um, Sometimes things are wrong, before they go to print.
Yeah, and the old books are still good. Like when a scientific name gets published, it's always valid, even when there's a better scientific name. But it's really good to have kind of a modern book. It's nice to learn the more correct names. I see someone on here asked, would you recommend attempting to grow your own mushrooms or foraging instead? And for me, that's an easy question to answer, and that's definitely foraging. And that's because it's just so nice to be out into the woods and you go out there, you see all sorts of cool stuff, not just mushrooms, but all the plants and the birds and animals and all that kind of stuff. It's just really nice to spend time outside. And I think the wild mushrooms are really interesting. So I don't do any cultivation at all. In fact, I've never grown a single mushroom myself. Occasionally, I'll culture them on auger and then give away the cultures to people who do grow them. But I have so many different mushrooms here. It's like the last thing I need is more mushrooms. But if you're in a place where it's dry season or it's winter and it's not mushroom season, then foraging them is or growing them is certainly a really, really good thing to do. And there's a lot of ones that maybe don't grow in your area, and so really whatever you're into is best. But I really enjoy foraging, and I get way more mushrooms than I could ever eat just walking around the woods.
Yeah, I'm in agreement there. I find that if I'm trying to grow something at home, there's a really good chance that I'm honestly just going to forget about it, and then it's going to end up rotting in my grow chamber. So I'm much happier going out and seeing what's there. I think treasure hunting is a lot more fun than babysitting a grow block, but maybe that's just me.
Yeah, definitely. So probably the thing to do is just pick a bunch of mushrooms when it's season and then dry them. Um, Not too long ago, I tried this bolete gravy, and it was from dried mushrooms that have been picked in Texas like 7 or 8 years ago, and it was the best mushroom gravy I'd ever tasted. And And so dried mushrooms can be really, really good for all sorts of culinary things. So I think that's the way to go is just when the season's good, pick a bunch, dry them, and then you'll have mushrooms all year round.
Yeah, there are a few that I don't love dried, but for the most part, I think that drying mushrooms is the way to go because you'll run out of freezer space in 15 minutes if you're really into foraging. Some things, though, like I think a lot of the big polypores, the big edible polypores, are better frozen because of the texture. And there's a whole debate about chanterelles, whether it's better to dry them, pickle them, or freeze them. And I think usually I just end up freezing them.
Well, chanterelles are definitely delicious pickled. When you dry them, at least the ones out here in the West Coast get kind of tough. So a lot of people will dry them and then powder the dried chanterelles and then add that as like a soup thickener, and that gives a real nice chanterelle flavor. So that's a good way to go. I've also just saute them and then freeze them, and they freeze really well after they've been cooked.
Yeah. Got a question about are morels good dried? Yeah, dry your morels. One of the best things you can do for a dish is to dry your morels and then do exactly what Alan just said about powdering them. If you're making something with morels, you can add an extra punch of umami by just adding some powdered mushrooms in because they'll permeate the whole dish. It'll be really nice.
Yeah, that sounds super good. I see somebody says they freeze dry theirs, and that's a really good idea. Those freeze dryers are not cheap, but the freeze drying process, saves a lot of the flavors that are normally, destroyed or just, evaporate in the regular drying process. So if you ever see that, crunchy fruit in the store, that's all freeze dried, and you can do that to mushrooms, and it probably saves more of the chemicals in the mushrooms than any other preservation method.
Yeah.
And then drying also just concentrates the flavor whenever you dry anything.
Yeah, and generally, with mushrooms that have hydrazines, like morels, for example, if you are drying them in a dehydrator, usually the dehydrator is going to be hot enough that the hydrazines will blow off, if I'm not mistaken.
Well, morels don't have any hydrazines, but they do have another toxin, and nobody knows what the toxin is. So the hydrazines are found in Gyromitra and Helvella, but the morels are kind of over a little bit different, different family, and so yeah, nobody's discovered what that toxin in morels is, but it doesn't seem to be nearly as dangerous as hydrazine. So that monomethyl hydrazine, it causes cancer and it can kill you if you eat a whole bunch. And it takes quite a while for the sickness to kick in. Whereas morels, if you eat a whole bunch uncooked, then you'll get sick very rapidly. And so it seems to be a different thing than hydrazines, which is good.
Yeah, definitely. That is interesting. I will have to look into that because I had no idea. I was always told that they were hydrazines.
Oh yeah, people say that often, um, but I think yeah, the toxin morels is still a mystery.
The most nutritionally dense slash beneficial mushroom and how to eat it. Powdered, cooked. That is a big question and potentially kind of a loaded one.
Yeah, I think it'd be hard to beat lion's mane for a nutritionally dense slash beneficial mushroom. Since it kind of regenerates nerve tissue, it's really good for people that had traumatic brain injuries, and um, and really good for memory too. And they're also just delicious. So hard to beat lion's mane, but it's not just lion's mane that have those nerve growth chemicals. Any Hericium species also has that. So the bear's head, Hericium coraloides, or the Hericium americanum, those are all medicinal.
Yeah, I have noticed that. I think personally, I prefer lion's mane that is cultivated, and as far as taste, because sometimes they can be very bitter. But but it really just seems to depend on the growing conditions.
And I wonder if that bitter flavor that you're getting is actually the chemicals that people want that cause nerves to regrow.
Could be bitter medicine and all that. Let's see. Um, does lion's mane coffee still maintain its properties?
And that is a really good question that's really hard to answer. And so, lion's mane, the chemicals in lion's mane that cause the nerve growth are very difficult to test for. And so, you can test for them with HPLC, but the reference standard that you need to calibrate your HPLC is about $20,000. So you just get about 5 milligrams. So it's really difficult, really performant, really expensive to set up a testing lab to test for lion's mane. And so that means that we haven't really done a lot of testing to see like how stable those chemicals that you want are. And it would be really cool to get those reference standards, get an HPLC set up, and then just collect a whole lot of lion's mane strains from all over the world and see which ones are the most medicinal.
I would be interested to gather up a bunch of supplements that are making huge claims and see what those levels look like.
Yeah, definitely. That would be a good project.
A lot about lion's mane here.
One person said, "What time of year do mushrooms grow?" And that's a good question because the answer is it's always mushroom season somewhere. So one thing I like to do is go on iNaturalist and just identify like for the whole world. And then I can see like what's coming in and where the mushrooms look like they're in really good shape and they're not like starting to dry out or anything. And it's there's always somewhere in the world that you can fly to and it'll be really amazing mushroom season. But in the United States, in California where I live, winter is the coastal mushroom season, and then spring and summer is the mushroom season up in the mountains. And then the East Coast, it's mostly summer and fall, though morel season is always in the spring. So there's usually some kind of interesting fungi out there if it's been raining.
Yeah, here in the Midwest, it is fair to say that our good edible mushroom season is going to be anywhere from, say, April until about the end of November. But if you go a little further north, you could always look for chaga in the winter, where it's when it's easier to see. We have, enoki is a popular one here in the winter. We can find um, Hypholoma sublateritium sometimes, even as late as like mid-January. So there there's usually something happening. And if you're not so locked into everything needs to be edible all the time, you can find some incredibly beautiful fungi that are growing right now if you go outside.
And I think a lot of people are surprised to learn that the a lot of the mushrooms that people don't consider are edible to be edible actually are edible, and that's probably most mushrooms are actually edible. So I think there's maybe 80% of the mushrooms are edible, and not all of those have a really good texture, but only about a quarter, maybe a fifth of the mushrooms that are out there are poisonous, and then just about 1% are deadly poisonous. So you certainly don't want to eat random mushrooms, but if you do just find a random mushroom, it's more likely than not that it is edible.
Some things are simply inedible because they would be really difficult to eat, or they taste really bad, or they're really tiny. Um,
Yeah, like those Tylopolis can be super bitter, but then people will use them when they're brewing beer to give their beer the bitter flavor that hops would normally give them. So, they're not poisonous. They just will ruin your dish if you're not expecting it.
and some of the Talopolis are still really good. One of my favorites is Talopolis albuator, the black velvet bolete. They're beautiful, and they tend to be less bitter, a little bit more of like a creamy sort of texture and flavor. They're delicious, but if it says Talopolis at the beginning, sometimes people just don't even want to try them. But I make bitters with like Talopolis all the time, just random ones that I find.
That sounds really good. Actually, one person asked, are any mushrooms pregnancy safe, aside from the ones in the store? And, one interesting thing about mushrooms is they have thousands of chemicals in them. Just a couple weeks ago, a paper came out on psilocybe cubensis, and they found that psilocybe cubensis had 1,400 different chemicals present in that mushroom. And I think any mushroom that you find would have somewhere around that many natural chemicals present. And so that's why so many mushrooms are medicinal and mushrooms are poisonous, just because they're full of random chemicals that these mushrooms synthesize. But when people are pregnant, you kind of want to avoid random chemicals. So I would probably just eat kind of a boring diet, for pregnancy, and then do more experimentation or eat more of a varied diet, more of the obscure foods after the baby's born. Because when there's that many different chemicals in a mushroom, it's just really hard to know if there's any that would be safe. Because there's so many chemicals that are unsafe for pregnant people. But an apple has hundreds of chemicals too, but they're all typically safe chemicals.
Yeah, and in general, like food conversations, we need to really reframe the way that we think about chemicals because everything is made up of chemicals. So sometimes people will hear that something has like a complex chemical makeup and will be kind of scared of it because it's going to have a lot of unpronounceable words or something along those lines. But we are chemical beings. We are made up of chemicals. Our food is made up of chemicals. So
Yeah, I mean, organic food has just about the same number of chemicals as conventional food, which is to say, hundreds and hundreds of different chemicals in every bite. And most of those chemicals are really good for you, but not all of them. And then some people can handle certain chemicals that other people can't. Like chicken of the woods definitely have something that it affects a lot of people, but I have no problem with that.
I'm very glad I can eat chicken of the woods because I find way too much of it. I'd be very sad if I had
Yeah,
to leave that on the log.
yeah. And I see someone posted here, I hate to eat mushrooms, but find them fascinating and gorgeous. And I think, there are so many different edible mushrooms out there, and they all have different flavors and different textures. So there's probably an edible mushroom that everybody, there's at least one edible mushroom that everybody would like. But I find that if you cook mushrooms, certain ways, you can make mushrooms absolutely delicious, and then you cook them a different way, and they're like pretty yucky, and it's the same mushroom. So a lot of times, what I will do when I cook mushrooms these days is I take fresh mushrooms that I found in the woods and I chop them up and I saute them, like dry saute in a cast iron pan without any sort of water or oil or anything. And a whole bunch of water comes out of the mushroom and then that boils away. And then I'll add some butter and cook them until they're golden brown on all sides. And then I'll add some fish sauce. And the fish sauce gives them a real salty flavor. So that gives them a very umami flavor. And I just keep adding fish sauce until they have the right amount of saltiness, and then I will add a little bit of sugar. And I don't add so much sugar that it tastes sweet, but that balances out the saltiness from the fish sauce and it gives the mushroom like a really intense umami flavor. And so just about any mushroom cooked that way will be really delicious. And people who do not like mushrooms would probably like eating them that way.
Yeah, I think the mistake that a lot of people make when they are cooking mushrooms, and the reason why a whole generation of people talks about how they hate mushrooms is mushrooms are mostly water, 90 to 93% for most of the species that we like to eat. And if you encase your mushroom in oil, that water has nowhere to go. So it will present as sliminess. And most people finds that a slimy mushroom is not a pleasant thing to eat. So by doing that, I even add a little bit of salt when I'm doing my dry fry to pull even more water out. And once you get that nice crust on there, then you're in the sweet spot.
That's a really good idea.
Here. Oh, there's a question. How do we feel about like tapping or flicking a mushroom prior to plucking or cutting it in order to spread spores?
That's a good question. And then there's 1,000 other related questions that we could talk about. But flicking a mushroom does not release any of the spores. So there's no reason to tap the caps or anything like that. But if you want the mushrooms to persist, I think the best way to pick mushrooms is to gently pull them out of the ground. And if you're picking them for photography, what you'll do is gently pull them out of the ground and kind of set them up for a photo. And then if you're going to save them for science, then you just take them that way. But if you plan to eat them, then you should cut the stem bases off, leave all of the dirt in the forest, and then you can plant those stem bases in fresh substrate. So if it's a mycorrhizal mushroom, then you plant those stem bases under a nearby tree of the same type. So like if you found it under oak, you can plant it under like the next oak tree over, and those will grow there the next year. And that way, when you get home, the mushrooms will be nice and clean. You won't have to wash a lot of dirt out of the gills.
Yeah,
Um,
always field dress your mushrooms if you can. It makes a huge difference, and it's better because you are doing the function of, um, spreading the spores, if you will. You're sending them on their way.
Yep. And then another thing that's really good to do is like when you're walking down a trail and you pick a mushroom to look at it, which is definitely something you should do because a lot of mushrooms look the same from the top. And it's really the underside where so many mushrooms look really different. So if you see a mushroom and it catches your eye, you should definitely pick it up and take a close look at it, look at the underside, look at how the gills change color as the mushroom matures. That'll tell you what color the spores are. And then it's safe to taste any mushroom. So you can taste a little bit, spit it out, smell it, feel all the textures, and just really get to know it. But once you're done with it, looking at it, if you're not going to bring it home, either to eat or for a scientific collection, you should take that mushroom and throw it pretty hard. And there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is that if you just leave a bunch of mushrooms picked right by the trail, it looks kind of like litter for the next week or two before they decompose. And the other is that that helps spread the spores. So if you can throw the mushroom, it'll land in a new place. It'll make spore prints wherever it lands. And that's what the mushrooms really want. So, it is nice to leave mushrooms there, but from the mushrooms perspective, it's much nicer to actually pick it and throw it somewhere else because the whole point of a mushroom is to move those spores to a different location.
Yeah, mushrooms don't have feet, so it is nice to be able to help them along their way.
And the spores, they try to catch the breeze, but 99.9% of the spores land within just a couple inches of the mushroom. So that's one reason a lot of mushrooms are so delicious is they're trying to entice animals to pick them up and get covered in spores, bring them up to other places, and that's how they spread around the forest.
Let's see, how do you feel about the collection of conchs and other hard perennial polypores? This is a good question because this is where sustainable mushroom foraging comes into the conversation. And sustainable mushroom foraging is a very nuanced topic.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I feel the same way as you do about the conchs. And that's like if it's a big, beautiful conch, it's there because it's been growing for many years and they have a long lifespan and they're going to keep releasing spores for many years. So generally, I will leave them. Though if you find a whole bunch, like you find a tree that has, a stump that has maybe 20 Ganodermas on it, it's totally fine to take a few of those for tea. But you find a big, beautiful conch, especially if it's near a trail, it's best to leave that there.
Yeah, I agree. Um, yeah, if you only find one of something, it's generally not a bad idea to just let it be.
Especially if that something is a plant. Because when you pick a plant, that really sets it back. And, it might resprout from the roots, but, it's definitely done for the season. Whereas when you pick a mushroom, you're just picking the fruiting body. So it's sort of like picking an apple off of the tree. So, like if you pick every fleshy mushroom in the forest and then come back a month later, they all come back after it rains. So, picking mushrooms is a very sustainable way to get food from the forest. But you definitely should be kind of careful about the habitat and try not to trample or cause do anything that would cause erosion or anything like that.
Yeah, most of the time, the damage that I see from foragers is not that they picked too many mushrooms. The damage is that they trampled several rare plants, or that they trampled like very sensitive habitat in order to reach those mushrooms. So you have to be super aware of your surroundings in order to make sure that the habitat that that mushroom likes to grow in remains preserved.
Yeah, and mushrooms don't really like to fruit from really compacted soil. They kind of need space in between the decaying leaves to develop.
Yeah, if we want mushrooms to save the world, then we really need to make sure that they have the space to do that.
But the biggest problem that mushrooms are facing by far is not foragers, is habitat destruction. So, if you pick every mushroom in the woods, they'll come back, next time it rains. But once they turn the woods into a parking lot, those mushrooms are never coming back. And I also noticed that in clear cuts, the mushrooms are pretty boring. So when I go to somewhere that's been logged, I'll find the same 40 mushrooms that I would find in someone's backyard. Whereas you go to the forest that's been growing for 50 or 100 years or more, then you start seeing much more species diversity. So really, if you want the mushrooms to be preserved, preserving the habitat is something that's really critical.
Definitely. Yeah, and a lot of times that habitat ends up being destroyed because people don't know that there is anything special there. So,
Yeah, definitely. Like, I cannot count how many times my favorite porcini spots and morel spots have been logged. And, the morel spots, sometimes they fruit after the logging, but the porcini spots, they fruit reliably every year. And then once they cut the trees down, they're gone for many, many years.
mhm. Here's a question. Do mushrooms provide nutrients that a vegan might struggle to get? Yes, particularly vitamin D3, which is often found in animal products like egg yolks and organ meat. Mushrooms have the ability to trap vitamin D from the sun and make it bioavailable to you. And that is a really important thing because without vitamin D3, your body struggles to utilize calcium.
Yeah, and
And lots.
also like low vitamin D levels cause depression, and it's not good for your immune system. So yeah, that's a really important nutrient. I just visited Savannah, Georgia, where my friend Clay runs a restaurant called The Haunt, and that is a vegan restaurant. And everything on the menu has mushrooms in it, mostly wild foraged mushrooms. And that food was some of the best food that I've ever tasted. So I think mushrooms are a really good thing to add to a vegan diet.
Yeah, they're also very high in protein for the most part and pretty low in fat. So they can help to supplement a diet where it's easier to get fat than it is to get protein, like a vegan diet. Yeah, forest management is actually crucial to the health of the forest fungal community. Um, because so much of what we end up having to do in forest management is managing invasive species.
Yeah, and like when they do logging, if they just leave a few big trees here and there, that's so much better than cutting all of the trees because then the fungi can repopulate the forests from those old trees.
Yeah, other people losing porcini spots, being turned into Vineyards. Yeah. Um, yeah, regarding like clear cutting, as this person is kind of arguing in the comments, porcini are mycorrhizal fungi, and if you take the trees that they're associated with away, then you will not get porcini. That is fact. Um,
Yeah, I mean, there's about half of the mushrooms that you see in the forest are ectomycorrhizal, so that means that they need a live tree to fruit. And if that tree gets cut down, then those mushrooms do not fruit. And what you have instead is all of the sapotrophic mushrooms fruiting. And so that's all the chanterelles, all the porcini, a lot of the really interesting mushrooms that you see in the forest just do not fruit, again for a very long time once the trees get cut down.
mhm.
Someone asked about plastic and oil-eating fungus, and I actually have tried both of those things. Most of the plastic-eating fungus stuff is clickbait, and so there's these articles that say like this plastic-eating fungus will like save our land, save us from having all this plastic in the landfills, and so there's one that's called Pestalodiopsis microspora, and it's pretty hard to get a hold of, but I was able to order it from the ATCC, the American Type Culture Collection. And when you order from the ATCC, you have to sign a paper saying that you will not give the culture to anybody else. So I ordered this plastic eating fungus, and then I immediately made a whole lot of petri dishes and sent it out to everybody that wanted it. So now everybody has plastic eating fungi. But the problem with it is that it doesn't really work for eating most types of plastic. So if you read the paper that they published that in, they were using liquid polyurethane, and liquid polyurethane is not a common plastic. So I tried lots of different plastics with this plastic eating fungi, and it just didn't do anything. Did not appreciatively like eat, do anything to the plastic. It didn't even like dent it or pit it or anything. So I think there's a lot of different kinds of plastics. So even if we do have a plastic eating fungi that works really well, that's only going to eat one kind of plastic. And so that's not really going to be a solution to our plastic issues.
Yeah, I think that often those clickbait titles come across. They come across as a little bit silly to me because I'm pretty sure that in order to deal with our plastic problem, we have to just stop producing and using so much damn plastic. There isn't going to be one big fix. There's no Deus ex machina. Um, it's going to be a multifaceted approach, and the biggest thing that we can do is consume less, and specifically hold corporations accountable for how much they are consuming.
And also hold corporations accountable for what they're producing, because I do not like buying plastic, but I buy plastic every single day. And, it's kind of hard to replace plastic. Like you can replace plastic with, paper or cardboard, but then you can't see the products that are inside the packaging. And consumers want to see the products before they actually buy them. So that kind of means plastic is going to be something that's going to be filling up our shopping carts for the foreseeable future. But definitely, the less we can buy, the better. And I feel like whenever you buy something at the store, you're paying people to destroy the environment. And one of the ways you're paying people to do that is when they pump the oil out of the ground to make the plastic. That's not good. And then they burn all that oil to get the product from the factory to the store. And so like whenever you spend any money at all in any store, you're paying them to destroy the environment. And so I generally try to buy only things that I need. And that's good for a lot of reasons. It's good for the environment, and it's good for my pocketbook, and it's also good just just to like be lighter on the earth.
Definitely. And those of us who can make the decision to be lighter on the earth can make it possible for, people who need medical supplies that come in single-use plastic. We can make it a little bit easier for them to be able to use the things that they need if we're not also using as much.
I see someone here says favorite mushroom ID book, and that depends entirely on what part of the world you're in. But in the West Coast, mushrooms of the Redwood Coast, and all over the world, there's different mushroom ID books. But that website, mushroomexpert.com, works pretty well for the whole United States. So mushroomexpert.com is basically like an online field guide, and it's just about as good as any other book that you can buy. So I generally tell people to go with online resources rather than to buy books because everything changes so quickly, and there's so much more available online than you could fit into a book.
Definitely. Yeah, glass is a good option. Aluminum is a really good option here in the US. We can recycle like something like 99% of the aluminum that we produce and reuse it. Is there a better region for sequence ID? I'm not sure what
Um,
that means, but
I think they're talking about the different genes that you can sequence.
sure.
So usually when people want to identify something by DNA sequencing, they'll sequence the gene called the ITS, or internal transcribe spacer. And that is a highly variable gene. So even closely related species generally have a different sequence. But when you're identifying something, you generally want to sequence whatever gene other people have done the most sequencing. Because when you get a DNA sequence back, it means nothing on its own. It doesn't have any meaning at all until you compare it with all of the other sequences. So everyone else is sequencing ITS. And so because that's the most commonly sequenced gene, then that's going to be the best gene to sequence for identification. And it's variable enough that you get pretty good species level resolution. But I've tried sequencing a lot of different genes, and I'm always disappointed with the results I get when I sequence other genes because there's just not very much in GenBank from these other genes. So ITS is definitely the best one. And then if that doesn't answer your question, then I'll sequence LSU and TEF1 and RPB2 and a few other ones. But 90% of the time, ITS answers my question. And then when ITS doesn't answer my question, the other genes generally do not answer my question either.
Goodness, there's a lot to go through here.
There really is.
Wow. Are there any restrictions on naming newly discovered fungi? Asking for me. Nice.
Yeah, there are. To officially name a mushroom, it actually just got a lot easier in 2014. Before that, you had to publish in a peer-reviewed journal and you had to write a Latin description of the mushroom. And that's no longer the case. So you don't need to do Latin anymore. Now, English is fine. It doesn't need to be a peer-reviewed journal. It just needs to be published somewhere that has an ISSN number or an ISBN number. So that could just be like as easy as throwing a PDF on a web page. But there's still a lot of nomenclature rules that need to be followed when you name a new mushroom. And those are spelled out in the International Code of Botanical Nomenclature. So there's a website that has all of those on there. It's a pretty long code, but there's like books that help you with it, like called The Code Decoded and things like that. But one rule is you cannot name a mushroom after yourself. And so that's probably a really good rule, so people don't just go around naming everything after themselves. And another rule is it has to be Latinized or Greek, so that way there's not like one language that like kind of like is used, more important than the other languages. We use kind of like these old dead languages to make the scientific names. But the best names are names that reflect a unique characteristic that the mushroom has. So I could like name a mushroom after my friend, but in 10,000 years, that name will still be in use, but no one will know who my friend is. So I try to figure out like what makes a mushroom unique and, try to suggest names that refer to that uniqueness.
Yeah, there's a good example. Can't remember the genus, but the species is Squarepantii, and it has something to do with how the spores look kind of square. Um,
Yeah, well,
and
that's Spongiformis
yeah,
squarepantii.
Fungiformis.
So that was a genus in the Boletaceae, so it's in the bolete family, and it was described from New Guinea. And that one, they named it Spongiformis squarepantii because they said that under an electron microscope, the fruiting body looks like the underwater home of SpongeBob SquarePants. And so I wrote the guy who named it that, and I asked him if he could share a photo of the scanning electron microscopy so I can see what he's talking about. And he did. He uploaded it to Mushroom Observer. So if you search for Spongiformis squarepantii on Mushroom Observer, you'll be able to see the photo that he's talking about that he named after SpongeBob's home.
Yeah, informative Latin names are definitely really helpful. Yeah, Viburnum acerifolium. It's a viburnum that has maple-like leaves, hence acer being in the name. It's just it makes it a lot easier to learn the name if it is something that you're running across frequently, and to understand
Yeah,
certain characteristics of the organism you're looking at.
yeah, that's a great name. And like sometimes people name stuff after a place, but then you always find that thing in some other place. One person asked how it's figured out if new mushrooms are edible. Is there a safe way? And really, the answer is not really. There's a few ways, but generally, somebody had to eat a mushroom to see if it was edible the first time. And then if they get poisoned, then they will tell their friends and write it in their books. And so a lot of poisonous mushrooms are found.
Oh, I think we've lost Alan for a second here. I want to make sure that it's not me. Not me. Okay. Hopefully we'll get Alan back here in a minute. Oh, we just lost him. We'll see if he comes back here. Um, let's see. Yeah, but how's it figured out if new mushrooms are edible? I really want to hear the end of his answer there. It looks like he's probably gonna try to come back here. Okay, I think I see Alan again. I'll invite him again. And we will see. Yeah, there have been some really great questions here. Can Lactarius indigo be grown at home? So Lactarius indigo, your best bet is to find a tree that it likes and chuck some fruiting bodies like under the soil in that area. I think you would have a difficult time trying to grow it on agar. I'm not sure if you could. The water sounds, yeah, that's from my cat's water fountain because they will dehydrate themselves if they don't have a fountain. But yeah, here in Michigan, Lactarius indigo are associated with white pine. How do you become a mycologist? Well, I guess this is a good question because I you can kind of call yourself a mycologist if you do mycology. Um, some people will say that they are amateur mycologists. In fact, Alan says that he's an amateur mycologist. I think most people would just call him a mycologist. Wood bluets are they related to Lactarius indigo? They are in a different genus. Wood bluets are in the genus. Some say Clatosopi and some say Lepista. And oh, it looks like Alan is rebooting his phone now. It may have overheated. Thank you for the hat and the mustache, by the way. Yeah, you find. Let's see. where can you go for schooling? There aren't many programs here in the United States that offer a mycology program. In general, if you want to study mycology, you're going to end up going to school for something like plant pathology. And that is just because most plant pathogens happen to be fungal. Environmental studies, plant pathology. Sometimes at the PhD level, you can find a mycology program or something that is effectively a mycology program. I think the University of Michigan has one. Oh, I see Alan is back. Let's give him a little invite. Evergreen State College in Washington State. I know there are a few labs. I know there are a few mycology programs, but there are not very many. Generally, if you want to study mycology, you should probably go to a school that has a noted mycologist on their faculty. Yeah, an agricultural school like Michigan State. There are definitely programs where you can do that. Oh, there he is. Let's see. Oh, I think we're getting him back. Yeah, Michigan State has some. I know a couple people at MSU. There is a guy who studies truffles. His name is Judd. Yeah, soil biology. Yeah, I mean, a lot of soil is honestly just mycelial threads.
And I think I'm back. Do you hear me now?
I can hear you. I can't see you, but I can hear you. Yeah, MSU has a program. Land grant colleges. Yeah, there you are. Cool. So while you were gone, we had some people asking about formal study for mycology, which is an interesting question for us because I don't think either of us are formally educated mycologists.
No, but it's a good question, and it's a question I get a lot, so I can talk about it for a second. I never went to college for anything. I just started doing it. Just started, learned everything just by walking in the woods and spending a lot of time outside. And then I learned a lot by editing Wikipedia articles, kind of back before there was a big mushroom scene on the internet.
Oops. We might be losing Alan again. Send him a quick message here. But yeah, when it comes to education, sometimes people can get formal education, but generally, if you want formal like mycology degree, you are gonna have to like go to Europe, and even those there aren't very many. There just aren't many mycology degrees because again, the discipline of mycology has not been around for very long. Once changed the chaga Wikipedia from mycorrhizal to parasitic. Yeah, and chaga's not even a mushroom. Tell Alan to turn his screen off. To put on Mycology Girl. Yeah, let's do it. We'll pop Mycology Girl on here too, and then we can do. Let's see, where'd you go? Oh, there you are. Yeah, we'll pop you on here, and then we can get Alan, and all of us can just gab on about fungi. No, chaga is not a mushroom. Chaga is what's called a sclerotia or a mass of mycelium. Hello.
Can you see me?
I can't see you. I can hear you.
Oh, man. Hey, there you are.
Hey. Okay.
Hi. Interesting live so far.
So far. Yeah. So we have another mycologist here. This is Mycology Girl. Mycology Girl, do you have formal education in mycology?
No, I do not.
Yeah, most of us don't. I've had a few people like yell at me in the past because I've described myself as a mycologist because I study fungi, and then say that I was like, not respecting the credentials of real mycologists. And I'm like, buddy, have you ever met a real mycologist by your standards?
Yeah, like
they're all like mycology is an amateur driven scientific discipline.
Yeah, unless you want to study soil pathogens for farms.
Yeah, and a lot of people who study like plant and soil pathology are not going to know anywhere near as much as you or I would know about like macrofungi.
No, the real mycologists that I have interacted with tend to be kind of shitty, slash, like, I don't know, they're very niche, and they act elitist, and they certainly don't run around on social media. It's their jobs, so they're different. They're like scientisty, not fun.
Mm-hmm. It's a different kind of vibe.
Yeah.
Okay.
Oh, Missing Meadows, you rock my world too.
Missing Meadows is great.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
in the dollar info from folks that didn't have formal training. Yeah, it's kind of true. You know, most of us who want to learn more and want to make sure that we're steering clear of like the misinformation that gets passed down like telephone are we have to like do a little bit of learning outside of the folks that didn't have the formal training too. That is an important thing.
It's like, yeah, okay, I might not have a master's degree in mycology because they don't exist, but do you want some really fucking enthusiastic people? Well, here we are.
Let's see. Oh. Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Mycology is really quite an open discipline. We have a number of people who can be a little prickly, especially in some of the Facebook groups, but overall, people are happy to see others learning and to help.
Yeah. Yeah, and it doesn't feel like it's gate kept, you know?
Yeah. Also, stale champagne. I don't think that any of us need to worry about mispronouncing words because that's part of why Latin was used for so long. Like, who cares? If you know what I'm talking about, then communication has been achieved.
Yeah.
Yeah.
In a court of law, would they understand? Yeah. Who
That
cares?
No.
Yeah.
Hericium, Hericium, Hericum, I don't care. I know what you're talking about.
Okay, so let me critique Gordon for a minute. I'm fascinated by fungi. He says chanterelles, like with a twist, and that's just not how I pronounce it. I call them chanterelles, chance. There's none of this in there. How do you pronounce yours, though? Chanterelles.
Chanterelle.
God
I
dang
say
it.
you.
Only always. I make this shit up as
It must be a coast thing because I'm originally from the East Coast too. I don't know.
Okay, pronounce boletes for me.
Believe.
Okay, I call it bolette.
Oh, that one.
Bolette.
That one's weird to me. I'm not going to correct anybody because who knows which one of us is right. But bolette just sounds too much like marionette or something like that. Chanterelles like pantels, chants and or chants and chanties, chanterelle.
Fancy.
Okay, there we go. We've got request to join. Hopefully,
All right.
Alan.
I'm gonna hop off.
Welcome back. Mycology
Okay.
girl. And oh, she popped offline just to fill the space, but it was very nice to have her as well. Another really great identifier.
Yeah, she's great. Did it replace her with me? You know, like you can only have one person in there at a time.
I think she left. It said she left of her own accord. So,
Okay.
yeah.
Well, about the pronunciation, you know, the most important thing is to not drop any syllables. And the other rule is say it quickly and with confidence. But the actual way that you pronounce it doesn't really matter. So they say scientific names in different pronunciations in every country in the world, generally like with whatever pronunciation they have in their language. So like in the United States, we'll say Satharella. In Mexico, they say Satereya, and we all understand each other.
Yeah, the beauty of Latin. Yeah. Okay. Oh, yep. Thank you for the 69 chilies, by the way, mycology girl. It's always fun when you send me 69 of anything. Um, yeah, quickly and with confidence is the way to go. So just before that, I'm trying to remember what we were talking about here. Oh yeah, you were talking about formal education, and I kind of shared a little bit while you were gone about how I don't have formal mycology education, and when mycology girl popped on, she was talking about how she also doesn't have formal education, and some of the reasons why that is.
Well, when you kind of go to school for something and then you do it for your job, then you're probably, a lot of times that takes away your passion for it. So, a lot of these people, they're just not quite as passionate as some of the amateurs who just learned on their own because they love it. So that's one thing. But sometimes some of the professional mycologists are super cool, and and then some of them less so. But like some of the people I mentioned at the beginning are just really, really helpful and super nice people. So everyone's different, but I do not think you need a formal education to become a mycologist. I think mycologist is someone that studies mushrooms, and anybody can study mushrooms.
Completely agree.
And you don't even need a formal education to get a job as a mycologist. I've had a couple of mycology jobs, and they just like when you're just graduated, like people are kind of interested in like what your degree is in and everything. But after you've been working for a while, nobody really cares, what you went to school for because that's not really how you learn all the advanced stuff anyway.
Yeah, definitely. And a lot of people who have formal education in mycology, we're talking people who went and got degrees in like plant or soil pathology. They're not looking at the same mushrooms that we are a lot of the time. Um, they're looking at things under a microscope all day that can only be seen under a microscope. Whereas you or I might be looking for, macrofungi that they may not even be able to identify. Just due to the specificity of their education.
Yeah, and there's a lot of money in plant pathology, so a lot of professional mycologists just look at these fungi that cause problems for crops, which is, okay, but can't be very much fun.
Yeah, I like to go outside and see things. It says, please tell Alan hello from Jasmine from the Perry Lab.
Oh,
So,
cool. Hi, Jasmine.
yeah. I saw Sasha in the comments as well. Hi, Sasha.
Oh, yeah, there's Sasha from Midwest Mushroom Camp.
Yeah, Sasha is Midwest Mushroom Camp. Oh, and Ariel, who we were just talking about. She's here too.
Oh, awesome.
So
I was
many
just
cool.
saying how much I appreciate all of the identifications on iNaturalist from Ariel.
Yeah, Ariel's a rock star. So we've talked about iNaturalist a little bit here, but there are a lot of people who I think don't realize how useful of a tool it is and how important it is to citizen science. Is there anything that you can tell people about getting started on iNat and like what some of the best sorts of images to take are, how they can get involved in all of the amazing science that's happening through iNat?
I could talk about iNaturalist all day, but I'll just say a couple of the most important things. One of them is that iNaturalist is an app and also a website, and the whole point of this app is to bring people closer to nature, and it's very successful at that. So you can upload a photo of anything in nature to iNaturalist, and there is an AI that will try to identify it. But the really cool thing about it that makes it way better than all the other identification apps is that there's real people that identify stuff. So when you create an observation on iNaturalist, it creates a permanent record for the thing that you found. And then people can go through and identify stuff. And so I'll usually flip through all of the mushrooms that have been found in California and put names on those. And then when I'm traveling, which has been a lot recently, I'll identify all the mushrooms that are found in whatever state that I'm in. And it's really cool because it shows me what's around and sometimes even very precisely. So if somebody puts up something and they don't know what it is, but I recognize it as something very rare, if they chose to share the exact GPS coordinates, which fortunately people often do, I can just go exactly to that spot and collect it, get really nice pictures of it. So that's one really cool thing about it. One thing I really like to use iNaturalist for is to learn the plants. So whenever I see a plant, if I don't know what it is, I will put it on iNaturalist, and the botanists that follow me will identify it. And if they don't, then I can just tag the botanists or send them the URL to the iNaturalist observation, and they'll tell me what it is. And then later, if I'm like, oh, what was the name of that plant? I can just search by location or by family and pull up my observation and be like, oh yeah, there it is. And then it keeps track of everything you found, which is really cool. And I find that the artificial intelligence on iNaturalist works really well for plants. If you take a picture that has both the leaves and the flower in the same photo. And then for mushrooms, it works really well if you take a picture that has both the underside of the mushroom and the top of the mushroom in the same photo. So if you kind of like carefully take photos like that, then the AI is actually pretty accurate. Though when I go through and identify stuff, half of the things that I correct are errors that the AI made. So, it does make a lot of mistakes. So you should never trust it 100%, but it's a good starting point. And when you're taking pictures of mushrooms, it's really important to take a photo of the underside because a lot of mushrooms look the same from the top, just like a lot of people would look the same from the top. But when you see their face, that's when you really tell like who is who in a person. And but the fungal equivalent is just the underside of the mushroom. So the gill, the base of the stem, pretty much want to get the whole thing. And I like to take a photo of mushrooms that have several different stages of development in the same picture. So someone asked if it would recognize a spore print. And no, there's so many mushrooms with the same color spores that a spore print is not going to help iNaturalist figure out which mushroom you have.
Get precise colors in there too, because a lavender colored spore print might just show up as white or pink, and that would be confusing.
But I do use spore prints a lot for identification. And what I mostly use spore prints for is for microscopy. So I can always already tell the spore color of a mushroom before I make a spore print. And that's by paying attention to how the gills change color as the spores mature. So if it's a white spored mushroom, the gills don't change color as the spore matures, and the gills just stay whatever color the flesh of the mushroom is. And then with dark spored mushrooms, the young mushrooms have whatever color the flesh of the mushroom is. And then the older mushrooms, well, the gills will change color to the spore color. So if you can like see a bunch of them in different stages of development, watch how the spore color changes as the mushroom matures, that tells you the spore print color. Also, a lot of times you'll see spore prints like on a blade of grass or on a nearby cap. And so you find spore prints out in nature. But what I really like spore prints for is microscopy. So I can find spores on the gills, but they're not always fully mature. And there's all these other little tissues that are pushing up on the cover slip. So I'll never get like a really amazing spore photo from the gills. At least it's pretty difficult. But if I have a spore print and put a little bit of a spores from a spore print on a slide, and then you do the microscopy that way, I know all the spores were forcefully ejected, and there's no tissue from the gills pushing up on the cover slip. So the cover slip sits very flat. All the spores are in the same focal plane, and makes for really nice spore photos.
Yeah, and on the topic of using iNat's AI, one thing that it can really help you with if you are very new to identifying mushrooms or plants is you may not know where to start looking at a field guide. You may not understand how to move through a key or what chapter to look at, what section to look at, but it can point you in the right direction. I find that iNat is often on point or pretty close when it comes to genus, and then you have to do more work to figure out the species.
Yeah, and that's a really good point. When I first started identifying mushrooms, it would take me half an hour to identify each one because I would just go through the key and flip through the whole book. And with iNaturalist AI, it can kind of point you in the right direction and make some suggestions, and then you can look up those suggestions. And the top suggestion isn't always the correct one, but usually the correct one will be in the top 10. And so you can just look that up, and that's a whole lot faster than trying to flip through a whole book.
Yeah, it's a nice shortcut, especially if you're in the field. And if you're wrong, somebody will probably come along and correct you.
And also, if you have a bunch of stuff on iNaturalist that needs identification, you can just message me your iNaturalist username. And then instead of just like flipping through random stuff on iNaturalist, I'll just flip through your observations and put names on all your things. And I do that for a bunch of different people. So totally happy to do that. So don't be shy. You can just send me a message on TikTok or Instagram or Facebook or email or whatever, and just mention your username, and I'll just go through and identify all your mushrooms really quick.
Yeah, for being a super busy guy, you were incredibly generous with your ID prowess, which I admire greatly.
Well, I figure it helps people in a lot of different ways, and it's kind of like a way I can give back to the community and get people more interested in mushrooms by identifying for them. And it also helps me too because it lets me know like what's fruiting at a certain time and what's out there, and just keeps it fresh in my mind so I don't forget anything.
Yeah, I think one of the best ways to really start nailing down your ID skills is just to start doing identifications. Start IDing things for people, especially when you're first starting out with identifying. Identify them in a public forum where other people can correct you if need be. Something like
Yeah,
or Reddit.
yeah, that's a really good way to get started. And that way, if you're wrong, somebody will come along and say what the right one is, and you can look up the differences, and they might even explain what it is that led them to that other name. Another really cool thing about the iNaturalist is the Explore feature. So if you open up the iNaturalist app, then you can hit Explore, and you can filter by like a certain species or a family. And so if I want to find chanterelles, I can just have it show me the nearest chanterelle observation. And you might see like a whole cluster of pins in some area, and then that's a pretty good chanterelle spot. You can go there, and even if there's no chanterelles there, when you go, you've just learned what the habitat for a really good chanterelle spot looks like.
Yeah. On the topic of habitat, I've found that one of the things that really just upped my game when it came to finding specific mushrooms, going out and specifically knowing what I was looking for, was learning trees. Man, if you learn trees, it is going to help so much when it comes to finding mushrooms, because mushrooms and trees are like this. If you know your trees and you're there in the right place at the right time, you're going to find mushrooms.
Yeah, and it's easy in California because we only have about a dozen common trees. But when I go out east, I'm always so confused by all the trees, and I try to learn them, but there's really a lot of trees out east.
Oh my gosh, yeah, I'm still learning trees every year. Um, Sometimes I make embarrassing mistakes with my trees, but I want to say Adam from Learn Your Land just came out with a whole tree ID course that you can purchase if you want to learn all the East Coast trees.
Oh yeah, that guy's really cool.
He is so cool. Um, One thing he was talking about recently that I'd never put together was the association between places that fruit Flammulina velutypes and morels in the spring. Evidently, there's a correlation there that I've never seen described anywhere.
Yeah, I haven't heard of that either. That's really cool. And I guess it's because they like the same trees, like the ash and elm and stuff like that.
And they probably like trees that are in a similar state of decay. I usually find Flammulina velutypes like growing under bark, and I often find morels growing in places where the bark is still attached but kind of starting to fall off. Yeah, Sasha finds flammulae all over her morel spots. The dead elms. Yeah, for sure. Oh, there's a lot here. Scrolling. Yeah, I'm bad with trees. Yeah, me too. I'm still learning. It's one of the nice things about spending a lot of time in the forest is that there's always something new to learn. It never gets boring. There's always just more. There's always just more to see, more to look at. And a lot of what Alan does is getting down really close to these super tiny things that people just walk over all day. You've taken some incredible photos of like these tiny lichens, these tiny little crust fungi that most people don't even see.
Yeah, I find that, the tiny mushrooms are really cool for a lot of reasons. One reason is that if the whole mushroom is only 2 millimeters tall, then every time you find it, it's going to be pristine because what's going to happen to a 2 millimeter tall mushroom? Whereas, a mushroom that's 6 inches tall, there's like bugs and wind and rain and dirt, all sorts of stuff like that. And there's also just so much more variety of tiny mushrooms. Like you can learn all the real big mushrooms pretty quickly, but you flip over a log and there's little tiny mushrooms there, and there's no one that knows all the little tiny mushrooms.
Yeah, tiny mushrooms make for great photos from Mind Over Mycology. Big ones are more boring. I find the closer that I get to a mushroom, the more interesting it becomes.
Definitely. And so, like the smaller a mushroom is, the more important it is to do focus stacking, combining multiple frames into one picture. And that's just because your depth of field gets smaller and smaller the closer you get. And that happens even more with a microscope. So with like the microscope, I'm enlarging something 400 or 1,000 times, and the depth of field is only like 2 or 3 microns at 1,000 times. So the focus stacking is even more important, and I'll stack together a whole bunch of microscope photos to make one where it shows everything in the same frame.
Yeah. Yeah, somebody's saying winter might be the time to learn the trees with not as many mushroom distractions. While that is true, if you want to learn your trees based solely on bark and other like growth patterns, then you can do that in the winter. I would say that it is easier often to learn trees when you have the added element of leaves, but it is more distracting. It's easier to get distracted by mushrooms and plants and critters and all that.
And
And a
one
lot.
person,
Oh,
oh,
go ahead.
sorry, one person says they found a bright orange red tiny mushroom in Costa Rica. And that's probably a hygrocebi. There's a lot of tropical hygrocebes, and they have really amazing colors. Absolutely beautiful little mushrooms.
I love hygrocebi.
Yeah, hygrocebes are some of my favorite, and they really need a lot of work. A lot of the hygrocebi that we find don't have names yet.
Yeah, last fall, my partner found some really interesting Gleophoras. Not sure of genus, possibly undescribed, but they are just some of the most beautiful mushrooms and the hardest to pick because they're so slippery.
Yeah, you really just have to pop them out from below with a knife.
Mm-hmm. We've had a few people ask about the mushroom death suit that's supposed to be a better option than a standard casket. I will confess that I don't know a whole lot about it. I know that a lot of these mushroom based like death products they seem a little gimmicky. A lot of it is just like baked Ganoderma mycelium, and I'm not sure that that's any better than cremation. But Alan may have an opinion.
I agree with you there. I think it's pretty gimmicky. And, anytime anything dies, the fungi and bacteria in the environment will consume it. But I don't think there's any kind of suit that you can make that would make that happen better or faster than the bacteria and fungi that are already there. So I think it's mostly clickbait and gimmicky, and there'll never be a time when people will like buy a mushroom death suit for when it's their time to go.
Yeah, if you want to be consumed by mushrooms, then just don't get embalmed. Let's see.
So I
Is it
wonder
sustainable?
with this red, sorry, go ahead. Oh,
You go
really
ahead.
quick. I wonder with this red fungus that was spread across a log that someone mentioned, kind of fuzzy. Um, I think I found something like that at Circle Pine Center. It was a red crust. Um, I know
Sasha.
there's like maybe I can pull it up on Mushroom Observer or iNaturalist.
Crusts are cool. We have some really pretty ones here in the Midwest.
Yeah, there's so many crusts and not very many people studying them.
Yeah, I can't remember what it was, but remember where it was. I'm that way too. I almost never have to consult my notes when it comes to like returning to a mushroom spot. I have very good horse sense in the woods. I just remember where the trees are and like what direction I turned, and I'm fine. But sometimes I just forget other useful information.
So here is the bright orange red crust I was thinking of that I saw in Michigan at Circle Pine Center. It is Flebia coccinea fulva. So pretty good name for a red and purple mushroom, but this thing was just bright, bright red and kind of fuzzy and covering a pretty big portion of a log.
Missing Meadows asks, what brought Alan to TikTok? What brought you to TikTok, Alan?
Um, that's a good question, and I'm not sure if I have a good answer for it. It seems like a good place to connect with people and share stuff about mushrooms. And, you know, a lot of what I try to do is get people excited about mushrooms. So if I can get people excited about mushrooms through TikTok, that sounds like a good use of the platform.
Well, people like mushrooms on TikTok. So you're in the right place. What's the trick to find morels? Habitat, timing, and trees. Get all three of those things right, and you will probably find them. Also, just like park yourself to find some morels, because sometimes people move too quickly through the woods, and they're not really taking the time to look for them because they do kind of blend in with that spring, like the dead leaves from last year. So you've got to keep an eye out.
And morels only fruit for about 3 weeks out of the year in any given spot. So it definitely has to be the right time of year. Out west, the best trees for morels are mostly fir trees. So at lower elevations, we have white fir, higher elevations, red fir, and those are both excellent morel trees. And then on the coast, the burn morels grow with redwood and madrone. So if you don't have those trees around, you just will not see very many or any. I know out east you have very different morel trees than we have out west.
Yeah, so here in Michigan, we have four basic species of morels that we can find with regularity that are easy to identify. You can find Morchella americana. You can find Augustus apes, which is our black morel. Punctipes, which is our half-free, and then diminutiva. And there are a few others as well that kind of go a little bit further in multiple directions, but those are the main ones that I run across when I go foraging, and they'll be associated with anything from elm to black cherry, to even some plants that they are associated with that are not trees. There are some morels that are possibly associated with grasses. Yeah, there's a lot that goes into finding morels, but there was somebody here who just asked about cutting versus plucking. This is a big debate in the mushroom world. If you go into any Facebook group and see a thread, my opinion is that a lot of the logic behind cutting versus plucking is not it's not good logic. Mushrooms are not going to sprout directly from the base of a mushroom that has been cut. That is just not how that works. You're better off gently plucking them and then trimming them and then burying whatever you've trimmed to encourage more fruiting.
Yeah, that's generally the case, though I think one argument for cutting is that sometimes there's little tiny mushrooms that are right alongside the other mushroom that you didn't see, and then when you pull up the mushroom, you'll see like a little baby mushroom. So if you had cut them, then that little baby one will have fruited. But that's not the majority of the time. And either way, definitely the best way to keep the mushrooms happy is to uh, pull the mushroom out of the ground, then cut the stem base off and plant that stem base in fresh substrate because that'll move the mycelium to a new spot. And so that's really helpful.
Yeah. A lot of people also pinch them. So rather than doing all of the trimming, especially if you're in a spot where you're finding a lot of them, you can just pinch them with your thumb and your forefinger. They break easily and just leave whatever's left in the ground in the ground.
I saw someone asked about the mushrooms that are coming up in California with all the rains. And yes, we're about to have the most amazing mushroom season we've had in a long time. Um, and so, the mushrooms, the best day to pick mushrooms isn't really like when it's raining or the day after the rain, because they're kind of waterlogged. It's best to wait like 3 or 4 days after the rain, and then like that week um, after the rain stops is going to be like some of the best mushroom hunting, and I'll just be outside all day, every day during that time, just taking advantage of all the good mushroom hunting that we have not been having for a long time.
Somebody asking a non-mushroom question. I'm planning to make Magolio this year. When should I pick the pine cones? You should pick them when they're about the size of your thumb up to the first knuckle. You can also pick them a little smaller than that, but you generally just want to get them when they're still green inside.
And what is Mugolio?
I think I actually have some right here. Magolio is a type of Italian fermented pine cone syrup. So it's
Oh,
really,
cool. I
yeah.
think I watched did you do a video on that recently?
I did a video on that earlier this year. You have to pick the pine cones when they're still small and green. But this is some Magolio that I haven't finished yet. It's just been sitting in there and just like macerating. But but yeah, it's a very like complex, fermenty, sweet, resinous sort of flavor that's really good for like braising things or you can use it. It's really good on ice cream, especially like a vanilla ice cream.
That sounds super good. And so you just take those little green pine cones and cover them with sugar, and then the sugar pulls the water out of the pine cones and makes a syrup.
Yeah. Yeah, you burp it like once every couple days for the first couple weeks, and then you just let it sit there for like 6 months or as long as you want because it's clearly been more than 6 months since we had green pine cones.
That's really cool. And I find the same process works for almost anything. Like you can take even like any vegetable or any fruit, like carrots, and just cover them with sugar, and you'll be surprised. Like 20 minutes later, after you just like slice up a carrot, cover it in sugar. 20 minutes later, like how much water comes out of those carrots and makes you carrot syrup. And I've also experimented with like jalapeno syrup or habanero syrup. You can just chop up peppers and it ends up making the syrup that tastes a lot like round table pizza.
Ooh, I'll have to try that. Yeah, it
Mm-hmm.
does work for
Pretty
pretty
spicy.
much any vegetable. I also like doing lacto ferments where you just weigh out whatever amount of thing you want to lacto ferment and then add back 2% of that weight in non-iodized salt. You just burp it like once a day for 5 days or so. And man, lacto fermented blueberries are like my kryptonite. they're like my Achilles heel. So
That
good.
sounds so good. And the lactobacillus is just in there naturally?
Yeah, I mean, you create a condition that lactobacillus will grow in, and it's just it works super well.
And do you think it's possible to lacto-ferment mushrooms?
You can lacto ferment mushrooms. I've never quite trusted it, just because I've never felt like I really had the right control over the pH to ensure that I wasn't accidentally like growing um, like botulinum or something like that. So I would have to get some pH test strips to really try it in earnest.
I've been making some pickled mushrooms recently, and those are pretty good.
Love
They,
pickled.
they go really well in sandwiches, and good way to preserve them. And some mushrooms that people don't think of as really good edibles make really good pickles.
A lot of the more bitter boletes I've found make really good pickles because the texture just helps everything to hold up well, and that like the salt and the acid in a pickle helps to neutralize a little bit of the bitterness.
And one person asked, is warm or cooler weather better for mushroom hunting? And it really depends on which mushrooms. Some mushrooms like to fruit when it's cold, other mushrooms like to fruit when it's warm. But in general, the majority of mushrooms grow better and faster when it's warm, as long as it doesn't dry out. So I find when it's like right around freezing, not much likes to fruit very much. But when you have it kind of significantly warmer, I find a lot more.
Yeah. What pH would be ideal for mushrooms? I don't remember the exact pH that you want for lactobacillus. I would have to look into that, but it is more of an acidic than alkaline. Um, this was a good question, and probably one that you are going to be more able to answer than me, but can you give us any info on mushrooms in desert biomes like the Sonoran Desert?
There are really cool desert mushrooms. And I found some good ones like in Baja California in the desert. And so, in the desert, it still rains. And when it does rain, the desert really comes alive. And that includes mushrooms. So one of the most common ones is this stalked puffball called Podaxis pistillaris. And so it's like 6 to 8 inches tall, and it looks like a shaggy mane. In fact, it's closely related to shaggy mane, and they sprout when it rains, and then they just kind of like slowly deteriorate and get and release their spores over a long period of time, and they can last for a long time. So that's one of the more common ones people see. There's also tulistoma, which are these little tiny stalked puffballs. A lot of puffball type things do really well in the deserts. And I find under mesquite trees is one of the best places in the desert to look for mushrooms. Like I'll walk through the desert all day and not see any mushrooms, and then I'll walk into a row of mesquite trees and there'll be mushrooms everywhere. And one person says they're getting excited for the Southern California mushroom season. And there's actually two fungus fairs coming up in Southern California. The first week of February is the Los Angeles Mycological Society Fungus Fair, and the second week of February is the San Diego Mycological Society Fungus Fair. And so I will be at both of those fairs, probably teaching workshops on photography or DNA sequencing or microscopes or something like that. And my favorite thing at the fungus fair is the night before the fungus fair happens, because that's when all of the identification happens. So everyone brings all the mushrooms they've collected, and then a few people put names on all the mushrooms. And if you really want to learn what all the mushrooms are and what the differences between all the mushrooms are, that's the best event to learn that, because you have a bunch of experts discussing among themselves why they're calling it this instead of that, and you learn a whole lot real quickly that way.
Yeah, one of the best places that you can be at any sort of like a mushroom fair or a mushroom camp is the ID table. You'll learn a lot. Whether you know a little about mushrooms or a lot about mushrooms, you're going to learn a lot at the ID table.
And someone asked if I've ever genetically modified mushroom spores. And no, I do a lot of DNA work, but the DNA work I do is reading the DNA. I'm not very interested in editing the DNA because I think mushrooms already do everything I want them to do. So there's really nothing that I would want a mushroom to do that I would need to program it to do. So yeah, I don't really plan to do any genetic modification with mushrooms, but it's certainly possible, even in a home lab, to genetically modify mushrooms. I just can't think of a good reason to do it.
Yeah, I think the more common thing would be genetic selection of mushrooms. If you're a cultivator, you might select for mushrooms that have certain characteristics or that you found growing maybe in certain climates. You know, oyster mushrooms are often selected for their tolerance to different types of temperatures. So that might be a reason.
Yeah, like a lot of times growers will clone a mushroom that either makes a whole lot of spores because they're selling spore prints, or a mushroom that doesn't make any spores. And that's a cool kind of natural genetic modification that happens. Or just like, they'll clone like the biggest fruit to get larger fruits, or, kind of like breed two of if you have like a couple mushrooms that have just treated really well, you can crossbreed those, and kind of generate just like Mendel did with all of his plant genetics breeding. You can do the same thing with mushrooms. I see one person ask, "What's the biggest lion's mane that I've seen?" And the biggest ones I've seen are maybe around the size of a basketball. Maybe other people have seen bigger ones, but I've seen bear's head that are quite a bit bigger than that. Sometimes the bear's head can be, 20 or 30 pounds, something like that. Just like if there's enough food, it can really take off.
Question about bioluminescence. Do we understand why bioluminescent fungi have that specific characteristic?
That's a good question, and it's really difficult to know for sure. But if you were like an insect in the woods at night, a bioluminescent mushroom would be extremely exciting. And so, a lot of mushrooms use insects and animals to move their spores around. So, I think attracting insects is a good theory. Another theory is that because bioluminescent mushrooms require oxygen to release a photon, that maybe the glowing is just a byproduct of their antioxidant activity, and they're trying to get rid of extra oxygen and free radicals that they have.
Am I mistaken, or is that also an explanation for bioluminescence in aquatic life? The ridding of excess oxygen.
I'm not sure. I don't know much about that. I have grown some of those bioluminescent dinoflagellates, and they make really good pets. You can just grow them in a jar, and then you shake the jar up, and you have all these little glowing spots flying around, and they're super cool looking. But I don't know much about like why they're glowing. I think all in those things, they people say that it's a defense against fish, like predation, like when they glow when they're disturbed. So if there's something big swimming around, it'll like disturb them and glow, and then the other animals will like see this glowing and they'll know something's coming. I don't know if it's true.
My phone is probably going to die here pretty soon, but I've probably got about 10 minutes before it does. So, are there any last questions? Can you talk about mushroom reproduction? Mushroom reproduction, that's an interesting topic because it's going to vary depending on the species. You know, you've got anything from like Schizophyllum commune, which has a really complicated sort of, people talk about it like it's a gender type of expression. And then you have other mushrooms that are a little more straightforward, but Alan will probably know more about this than I do.
Yeah, usually what happens is mushrooms will make a spore, and the spore has only half of the genome. And so when two spores land near each other, Well, when each spore lands, it germinates and makes monokaryotic mycelium. So monokaryotic mycelium has only half the genome. And if two spores land near each other, then those two monokaryons fuse into dikaryotic mycelium. And what happens is you have a nucleus from each of the parents, kind of like, and they are inside of the same cell. So then dikaryotic mycelium has these two nuclei, and the actual reproduction doesn't happen until it makes spores. So in the mushroom world, it's kind of like if the mushroom meets somebody, they'll live together for several months before they finally have sex, and then that happens in the basidia or the ascus when they finally make their spore. But there's a lot of other things that they can do. Occasionally, they'll make spores that have the full genome, so those are called asexual spores, and with those, it only takes one spore to make a new mushroom colony. And so a lot of types of fungi will have both strategies going on at once. You see that in xylaria a lot. Like the xylaria will often kind of have like white tips on the end of the fruiting bodies, and those are the asexual spores. And then later in its if it's in its cycle, then it will make sexual spores out of the parathecia, which are the little bumps on xylaria, and those are the sexual spores. So the thing about asexual spores is that you don't get any genetic diversity, so it's just cloning itself. And then with the sexual spores, you get the genetic recombination happening, so it's able to evolve and have more resistance from diseases and viruses and all that kind of stuff. So it's definitely possible to breed mushrooms like in a petri dish, and a lot of people are doing this more and more these days. And generally, what they'll do is they will take a bunch of spores and then throw them in some water and do some serial dilution. So they have an extremely dilute spore solution, and then you pipette that water out onto a petri dish. And you have it so dilute that only 3 or 4 spores germinate on a petri dish. And since you have those single spores germinating, those are monokaryons. So then you can take like different strains or sometimes even different species, let those monokaryons meet in a petri dish, and then you've just created a new strain.
There you go. Mushroom breeding. There's a whole conversation happening in the comments about oysters with stems. Oysters do have stipes. They just have decurrent gills that run all the way down the stipe.
Yeah, that's one of the differences with the angel wings, the Pleurisabella, is they don't really have a stem, whereas the oyster does have a stem. And one person says, why would they need a stem? And that's just to get the cap raised up so it can release the spores better.
Yeah. You do occasionally find oysters growing on the ground, but they're growing out of dead wood that is buried underneath the ground. The identification website that was brought up before was mushroomexpert.com. And you may also be referring to iNaturalist.
Mushroom Expert, iNaturalist, and Mushroom Observer are my 3 favorite websites for the mushroom identification stuff. And both Mushroom Observer and iNaturalist, you upload your photos of mushrooms, and people vote on what kind of mushroom you have.
Okay. Well, it looks like the questions are starting to kind of die down a bit, and my phone is about to die. So I think I'm going to go ahead and call it if you're cool with that, Alan.
Yeah, it's been really nice talking to you.
Yeah, you too. And you guys have asked some really great questions. So thank you all for joining us. We'll have to do this again sometime. This was really fun.
Yeah, anytime.
Awesome. Take care, Alan.
All right, have a nice evening.
All right.